I stood alone at the defense table, facing the man who had spent the last year trying to erase me from my own life. My father sat across the aisle, flanked by a team of elite lawyers, leaning in to whisper a final insult intended to shatter my resolve. "The military taught you how to hold a rifle, Elena," he sneered with a smug grin, "but it obviously didn't teach you how to hold on to your wealth." He laughed, certain that I was defenseless, until his lead attorney opened my counter motion and suddenly went deathly pale. The older man's hands began to shake as he recognized the precise, lethal structure of the legal filing, whispering a name he had only heard in high-level military tribunals. I simply opened my briefcase, revealing my JAG credentials and the Silver Star. My father thought I was a victim. He didn't realize I was the storm. The dust of Kandahar was still in my lungs when I pulled into the driveway of the Harrison estate in Ohio. For 15 years, I had served as an Army JAG officer, moving through combat zones and high-stakes military tribunals, where the truth was the only currency that mattered. I had seen the worst of humanity in distant lands, but I never expected to find a battlefield waiting for me in my own living room. My mother's funeral had been a cold, transactional affair, much like my father's business dealings. As I stood there in my dress greens, the weight of my Silver Star felt heavier than ever. I wasn't just grieving for my mother, I was mourning the ghost of a family that had clearly moved on without me. My father, Marcus Harrison, a man whose empire was built on luxury real estate, barely looked at me. My younger brother, Leo, stood beside him, checking his gold watch as if my mother's burial was an inconvenience to his social calendar. I had spent my entire adult life providing for them. At 22, I invested my inheritance and every cent of my early savings to help my father save Harrison Holdings from a hostile takeover. I was a silent partner, a daughter who gave everything and asked for nothing in return while I served my country. But as I sat in my mother's study that evening, looking for her will, I stumbled upon a different kind of paper trail. In the military, we use a special power of attorney, so our families can manage our affairs while we are deployed. It is a document built entirely on trust. As I logged into my personal investment accounts for the first time in 6 months, my blood ran cold. The balance was nearly zero, over $300,000. The entirety of my combat pay and savings had been drained through a series of authorized transfers. The trail led directly to my father's private account, but it didn't stop there. I drove out to the small Victorian-style house on the outskirts of town, the house I had bought with my own money 10 years ago as a sanctuary for my retirement. When I pulled up, I saw Leo's flashy sports car in the driveway. A new nameplate was bolted to the fence, the Leo Harrison Residence. My father hadn't just taken my money, he had used my military POA to forge my signature and deed my home over to my brother while I was overseas, claiming it was for the stability of the family legacy. The confrontation happened an hour later in my father's mahogany-lined office. I didn't shout. I didn't lose my temper. I stood at parade rest and laid the bank statements on his desk. "I want to know where my money is, and I want Leo out of my house by Monday," I said, my voice as sharp as a bayonet. My father didn't flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and looked at me with a terrifying kind of pity. "Elena, look at yourself," he sighed, gesturing to my uniform. "You've spent too much time in the sand. You're paranoid. You're showing signs of severe PTSD, and frankly, your recent behavior has us all very concerned about your mental stability." I felt the air leave the room. He wasn't just stealing from me, he was gaslighting me. "Leo and I have already filed the paperwork with the board of Harrison Holdings," he continued, his tone smooth and rehearsed. "Given your current condition, we've moved to have you declared medically unfit to participate in company decisions. We've done this for your own good, sweetheart. You need rest, not the stress of a boardroom." Leo stepped out from the shadows of the corner, a smug smirk plastered across his face. "Don't worry, sis. I'll take care of your assets. You just focus on getting your head right." They thought they had won. They thought that by using my service against me, I would simply retreat into the shadows like a wounded soldier. What they forgot was that I wasn't just a soldier. I was a JAG officer. I knew how to build a case, how to preserve evidence, and how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. They wanted to play a game of law and order? Fine. I had spent 15 years mastering the rules of engagement, and I was about to show them that in my court, there are no pardons for traitors. The Franklin County Courthouse felt less like a hall of justice and more like a theater for the wealthy. As I walked through the heavy oak doors, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hushed whispers of people who had never known the meaning of a fair fight. I sat at the defense table alone, my only companion a weathered leather briefcase and a legal pad. Across the aisle, my father had assembled a phalanx of legal talent that looked like they belonged on the cover of a high-stakes corporate magazine. At the center was Arthur Sterling, a man whose reputation for crushing inconvenient family members was legendary in the state of Ohio. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a predator in a $3,000 suit. My father, Marcus, didn't even look my way. He leaned back, whispering something to Sterling that made the lawyer let out a short, sharp chuckle. It was a sound designed to be heard, a sound meant to remind me exactly where I stood in their hierarchy. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice smooth and projecting a false sense of concern that made my skin crawl. "Before we proceed with the matter of the Harrison Holdings Board restructuring, we must address a more pressing and frankly heartbreaking concern. My client is deeply pained to be here, facing his own daughter in such a public forum." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the lie hang in the air like smog. "We are moving for an immediate mental health evaluation and a temporary conservatorship for Ms. Elena Harrison. As the court is aware, Ms. Harrison has recently returned from multiple combat deployments. While we honor her service, the evidence of her current mental instability is, to put it mildly, alarming." I sat perfectly still. In the Army, we are taught to breathe through the adrenaline, to keep our heart rate steady when the world starts to explode. I opened my notebook and began to write. Not a plea, not an emotional outburst, but a tactical log. "The defendant is currently unrepresented by counsel," Sterling continued, glancing back at me with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, which in itself is a testament to her lack of judgment. She claims she cannot afford a private attorney of the caliber this case requires. It's a tragic decline for a woman who once held so much promise. My client offered to pay for her defense, but in her paranoid state, she accused him of, and I quote, plotting her destruction. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. I could feel the eyes on me, pity, curiosity, and the cold judgment of the town's elite. Then came the evidence. My brother, Leo, took the stand with the practiced somberness of a professional mourner. He produced a series of printed text messages, allegedly from me. In them, I sounded frantic, delusional, and violent. "I'll burn the house down before I let you stay there," one read. "The voices in my head are louder than the sirens," read another. They were clever forgeries. They had taken fragments of real conversations about my military experiences and twisted them into the ramblings of a broken mind. My father wiped a fake tear from his eye, the perfect image of a grieving parent. "She's not the sister I grew up with," Leo whispered into the microphone, his voice cracking on cue. "She comes home and looks at us like we're the enemy. She keeps talking about evidence and conspiracies that don't exist. We just want her to get help before she hurts herself, or someone else." The judge, a stern woman named Miller, looked down at me over her spectacles. "Ms. Harrison, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? And I must ask again, are you certain you wish to proceed without an attorney?" I stood up slowly, my spine as straight as a steel rod. I didn't look at Sterling, and I didn't look at the fake tears on my brother's face. I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting with the same clarity I used to brief generals in the Pentagon. "I am aware that Mr. Sterling finds my lack of a high-priced legal team amusing. He mistakes my financial caution for a lack of capability. As for the allegations of my mental state, I would simply ask the court to note that the messages provided by my brother have no digital metadata attached. They are screenshots of a narrative they've built, not a reality I've lived." Sterling let out a loud theatrical sigh. "See, Your Honor? The paranoia. The immediate accusation of forgery against her own flesh and blood. It's textbook PTSD. She's fighting a war that ended months ago." My father finally looked at me then. It wasn't a look of love or even anger. It was a look of triumph. He thought he had me pinned in a corner. He thought that by stripping me of my home, my money, and now my sanity, I would break. What he didn't realize was that I was recording every word, every smirk, and every lie in my mind. I was observing their patterns, their weaknesses, and their overconfidence. In a court-martial, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one with the strongest case. I sat back down and picked up my pen. The humiliation was heavy, yes. The insults were sharp. But as I watched Leo smirk at the gallery, I knew one thing they didn't. They had just committed perjury in a recorded session. And in my world, that isn't just a mistake. It's a target. I didn't go back to the hotel to cry. In the military, emotions are like heat signatures. If you let them flare up, you become an easy target. Instead, I drove to a quiet, 24-hour diner 3 towns over, opened my laptop, and initiated a secure connection that my father's high-priced IT team couldn't even see, let alone track. The court hearing had confirmed one thing. My family wasn't just greedy. They were desperate. And desperate people always leave a trail. I reached out to Sarah Ghost Jenkins, a former Army Signal Corps specialist I had served with in Germany. She owed me a favor from a court-martial case, where I had cleared her name, and Sarah was the kind of person who never forgot a debt. I sent her the screenshots Leo had presented in court. "Sarah, I need the metadata. Every header, every timestamp, every digital fingerprint," I whispered into the burner phone. "And I need a deep tissue scan of Harrison Holdings' offshore accounts, specifically anything linked to my mother's estate." "Give me 3 hours, Captain," Sarah replied. Her voice was steady, a comforting reminder of the world I had come from, a world where competence mattered more than a last name. While I waited, I didn't rest. I began building a manual ledger. I went back through 15 years of board meeting minutes, tax filings, and property transfers that I had managed as a peripheral employee. I looked at the numbers not as a daughter, but as a forensic investigator. The first crack in their facade appeared at 2 a.m. Sarah's encrypted file landed in my inbox. The text messages were amateurish. Sarah had traced the original creation date of the images to a burner phone purchased in Leo's name just 48 hours before the hearing. They hadn't even bothered to spoof the internal clock correctly. It was a clear-cut case of fabricated evidence, a felony that Arthur Sterling had knowingly presented to a judge. But the second discovery was what truly made my blood turn to ice. Sarah had found a network of 6 shell companies based in the Cayman Islands, all registered under the name LH Legacy Partners. Since my mother's passing, over $4 million had been diverted from the Harrison Holdings main reserve into these accounts. It wasn't just my $300,000, they were gutting the entire company. And then I saw the kill switch. Buried in the digital fine print of the company's recent restructuring was a clause I had never seen. My father had used my military power of attorney to name me as the primary fiduciary officer for all offshore transactions. If the IRS or the Department of Justice ever came knocking, the trail of breadcrumbs wouldn't lead to Marcus or Leo. It would lead straight to me. They weren't just stealing my house. They were setting me up to be the fall guy for a multi-million-dollar money laundering scheme. They expected me to be too broken by PTSD to notice, and too broke to fight back. They wanted me in a mental institution not to help me, but to silence the only person capable of decoding their crimes. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a tactical engagement. I spent the next 48 hours in a focused trance. I didn't hire a lawyer. I became the lawyer they feared most. I drafted a pro-C counter-complaint, a document so dense with citations, forensic evidence, and constitutional precedents that it would make Arthur Sterling's head spin. I utilized the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, Standards for Evidence Preservation, knowing that Judge Miller had a reputation for respecting military discipline. I documented the forgery. I mapped out the offshore shell companies. I attached the bank records Sarah had unearthed, showing exactly when and how my father had betrayed my mother's final wishes. As the sun began to rise on the day of the follow-up hearing, I put on my best suit, not my uniform, but a charcoal gray power suit that screamed civilian authority. I polished my shoes until I could see my reflection in them. I organized my exhibits into color-coded folders, each one a nail in the coffin of my father's empire. Marcus Harrison thought he had sent a wounded lamb to the slaughter. He had forgotten that he didn't raise a lamb. He raised a JAG officer who had prosecuted war criminals in the middle of a desert. I checked my briefcase one last time. The evidence was absolute. The law was on my side. And for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't fighting for my country. I was fighting for my life. The storm was coming, and I was the one who had brought the lightning. I walked into the courtroom at exactly 08:55. In the military, being on time is being late, and I arrived with the calculated precision of an officer heading into a briefing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, irritating hum, but I didn't let it distract me. I took my seat at the defense table, opened my briefcase, and laid out my color-coded folders with a deliberate, steady hand. Across the aisle, Arthur Sterling was already in full swing, whispering confidently to my father while Leo leaned back, looking bored and entitled. They didn't even acknowledge my presence until the bailiff called the court to order. They expected a broken woman to walk through those doors. Instead, they got a JAG officer who had spent 15 years staring down war criminals without blinking. "Your Honor," Sterling began, rising with his usual practiced elegance, "we are prepared to move forward with the motion for conservatorship. Given the defendant's continued refusal to seek counsel, we believe the urgency of her mental state has reached a critical—" "I am ready to proceed, Your Honor," I interrupted, my voice cutting through the room like a cold blade. I didn't shout, but I projected from my diaphragm, a habit from years of addressing military tribunals. And for the record, I am not unrepresented. I am representing myself pro se. Sterling let out a dry, dismissive chuckle. "Your Honor, this is exactly what we warned you about. Ms. Harrison lacks the legal capacity to understand the complexity of corporate fiduciary law. This is a tragedy in motion." Judge Miller looked at Sterling, then back at me. "Ms. Harrison, you are aware that pro se litigants are held to the same standards as licensed attorneys in this court?" "I am, Your Honor," I replied, standing straight. "In fact, I would like to move for an immediate dismissal of the conservatorship motion based on Exhibit A through F, which I have just filed with the clerk." Sterling's smirk faltered as he reached for the copy of my motion. I watched his eyes scan the first page, then the second. I saw the moment the blood drained from his face. He didn't just see a legal filing, he saw a masterpiece of tactical law. The citations were flawless, the structure was lethal, and the forensic attachments were devastating. "My God," Sterling whispered, his voice barely audible to the gallery but clear to me. He looked up, staring at me with a terrifying kind of recognition. "Is that really her? The Iron Captain from The Hague?" He had recognized my workmanship. Years ago, before I disappeared into the shadows of special operations, I had established a signature style in international military law. Sterling was a student of the game, and he realized too late that he wasn't fighting an amateur. He was fighting a legend. My father's brow furrowed in confusion. "Arthur, what are you talking about? Just finish her." But Sterling didn't move. He knew the storm had arrived. "Your Honor," I continued, ignoring their internal collapse, "I would like to present the digital metadata analysis of the text messages submitted by my brother, Leo Harrison. My expert witness has traced the origin of these images to a burner phone purchased by Leo 48 hours prior to the initial hearing. These are not my words. They are a criminal fabrication designed to mislead this court." Leo's chair scraped against the floor as he sat up, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. But I wasn't finished. Furthermore, Exhibit D outlines a series of 6 offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. These entities have been used to divert $4 million from Harrison Holdings since my mother's death. Most importantly, I have evidence that my signature was forged on the documents naming me as the primary fiduciary officer. My father didn't just want to take my home. He wanted to use my clean military record as a shield for his money laundering. He planned to send me to a mental ward so that when the federal investigators arrived, I would be the only one holding the smoking gun. The courtroom went silent. I looked directly at my father. For the first time in my life, Marcus Harrison looked small. He reached for a glass of water on the table, and that's when everyone saw it. His hand was trembling. The man who had controlled every aspect of my life was finally losing his grip on reality. He tried to speak, to offer some commanding rebuttal, but nothing came out. He was a witness who could no longer control the narrative, facing a daughter he could no longer silence. Judge Miller leaned forward, her expression one of grim realization. She looked at the forensic records, then at Sterling, who had quietly sat back down, his head bowed. "The court finds the evidence of forgery and financial misconduct deeply troubling," Judge Miller stated, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I am ordering an immediate freeze on all assets tied to Harrison Holdings and the LH Legacy accounts. Furthermore, a court-appointed forensic auditor will be granted full access to all records effective immediately. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you advise your clients on the implications of perjury and federal fraud." I sat back down and closed my folder. I didn't feel a rush of joy, only the quiet, heavy satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The truth had entered the record, and as I watched my father stare at his shaking hands, I realized that the greatest weapon I ever carried wasn't a rifle. It was the truth he had tried so hard to bury. Thanksgiving in Ohio is usually a time of warmth and tradition, but this year, the Harrison estate felt like a monument to things lost. I didn't come for the turkey or the forced conversation. I came for the one thing that still didn't belong to them. As I walked into the living room, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of pine and the crushing weight of silence. My father sat by the fireplace looking frail, the commanding presence he had maintained for decades finally dissolved by the cold reality of the forensic audit. The fire crackled, but it provided no warmth to a room filled with the ghosts of our shared betrayals. Leo was in the corner, staring at a stack of legal bills that he could no longer expect me to pay. He looked smaller, stripped of the arrogance that usually defined him. I walked over to the mantel where he had displayed my silver star like a trophy he hadn't earned. I picked it up, feeling the cold, heavy metal against my palm. "This never belonged to you, Leo," I said quietly. He didn't argue. He didn't even look up. The fear of his impending court date for perjury and fraud had finally broken his spirit. He was no longer the golden boy. He was just a man facing the consequences of a life built on sand. My father cleared his throat, a sound that used to make me jump to attention, but now it just sounded tired and hollow. I suppose I thought that if I gave him everything, he would eventually become the man I wanted him to be, he whispered, staring into the dying flames. I punished you for being strong because it was easier than facing the fact that I made him weak. I chose comfort over character, Elena, and I lost both. In the military, we have a saying, I replied, tucking the medal safely into my jacket pocket. You can't build a fortress on a foundation of sand. You didn't protect this family, Marcus. You protected a lie, and you expected me to be the one to pay for it. I'm done being your insurance policy. I didn't stay for dinner. There were no apologies left to give, and no wounds left to heal. As I drove away from the house I grew up in, watching the estate fade in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange, profound lightness. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply stopped holding up the walls of a house that was already crumbling from within. For the first time in 37 years, I was truly free. As we watch Elena walk away from that estate, there's a heavy lesson in the silence she leaves behind. We often think of strength as something loud, a scream for justice or a show of force. But for Elena, strength was the quiet, agonizing discipline of a woman who refused to let her own blood turn her into a casualty. She didn't fight with hatred. She fought with the cold, hard truth that she had spent 15 years defending for a country that honored her, even when her own father wouldn't. It is a specialized kind of heartbreak when the people who are supposed to be your sanctuary become your greatest battlefield. Elena's journey is a stark reminder that your worth isn't a debt you owe to your family. It's a boundary you set for yourself. If you were standing in that courtroom, facing the people you once loved and realizing they were ready to destroy you, would you have the courage to stay calm and let the facts do the talking? Or would the betrayal have been too much to bear? I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to find your voice in the middle of a storm? Share your story in the comments and subscribe if you believe that no matter how deep the lie is buried, the truth always finds its way home.
Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. See you soon.